Hi, good afternoon. I apologize for not making it over here sooner. I think it's been it was summer, I believe, when I hashed all this out with General Counsel, and we've been meaning to get me here. This was begun a long time ago, at a time when I had a lot more free time to tackle projects like this. And I think it's a really important tool in the arsenal, Google Analytics is, for web developers. I have to confess that I think I was in front of this group more than a year ago talking about this, and at the time confessed that we had been using it for quite some time before we realized that we were potentially violating some kind of institutional policy in doing so. And compared to what I present today, we had a pretty immature version of how to, the doctrine as to how to use this in an efficient manner as an asset of the institution, as opposed to just something that, as an individual web developer, we were using for our site. So the current state of Google Analytics is that it has been decided by Libraries, Computing, and Technology. So David Gift helped to vet this, as well as the General Counsel's office, that it is acceptable to use Google Analytics. I kind of alluded to that a year or more ago, whenever it was I last saw this group. But we actually got to the point where we worked out all of the details in reviewing every line of the terms of service, the multiple terms of service involved, and we settled on essentially an acceptable use doctrine that says, as a web developer, as someone who's maintaining sites on behalf of the institution, to the extent that this is somewhat sensitive information, or at least has business value, the reports that come out of this, here's the steps you should go through in setting up an analytics account and deploying it on your site so that you're in line with MSU's institutional stance on sensitive information, you're in line with our acceptable use policy, you're in line with Google's terms of service, because they're pretty strict about what you do and do not do in use of the tracking cookie and in use of this reporting data. So that you have a step-by-step guide as to how to go about doing this, and you can feel relatively safe in terms of the cloud computing memo and other things that have come out of LCNT advising that use of cloud services, particularly free cloud services, should be taken fairly cautiously by MSU staff. We also have drafted a privacy statement. So this is what most web developers would call a privacy policy. The reason it's called a privacy statement is the use of the P word, policy, at MSU is reserved for the authority of the board, being the legal body under which the institution has its legal authority vested. That's the entity, the legal entity, and the board has to decide on official policy. The board didn't decide on this. The board is certainly not going to decide on any of your individual websites' privacy policies. So in MSU parlance, for your users, we thought the term privacy statement was equivalent. If you were to put a link at the bottom of your website that says privacy statement, we think most users of your website will understand what that means. And that's where the functional equivalent of a privacy policy, as most global web developers would call it. That's what we're going to call it, privacy statement. So we developed one of those. That was a necessary step in response to Google's terms of service. It's also important because it's just good etiquette, right? To be fairly transparent with your users about what information you collect from them, particularly when it happens behind the scenes and it's not immediately apparent to them, unlike filling out a web form, right? When we're doing this kind of tracking cookie stuff, it just happens routinely. There's nothing evident in the user's behavior that we're tracking information about them the entire time. So you want to expose, like, what are we tracking about you? Why are we tracking it? What do we intend to use it for? Who are we sharing it with? That's explicitly required in Google's terms of service if you're going to use analytics. And I will once again confess that when we first deployed Google Analytics, we failed to note that in their terms of service. Another good reason to have a standard set of practice at the institution. So before this meeting, we actually managed to get published a tech-based article on help.msu.edu about how to use Google Analytics. If any of you have a computer with you, you can pull this up by going to help.msu.edu and searching for analytics is the easiest way to get to it. It should be the first link that appears. So if I searched MSU's tech base, I'll make this bigger. Is that fairly readable? Okay. If you just search for analytics, it's this first link here. This is going to be the lasting documentation. This isn't something that's particularly well supportable by the help desk, right? Because there are people that are expecting to help you with fairly transactional technical problems. This delves into policy stuff, and in terms of interpreting the legal language here, if you're going to implement this and you go to read through this and you don't understand something you should do, At this point, you're probably going to be stuck emailing me, and I'll get back to you in a couple weeks, unfortunately. At some point, there will probably be a set of you that will have gone through this, and we'll have a better understanding. I know that some of the people in this room have already done this because they talked to me or we were going through it earlier. I know that Debbie's in the back of the room from the MSU Web team. Which sites right now have we already deployed this on, or have you already gone through the process of doing this?
And m.msu.edu.
Okay, so if you were to go there, you should see a privacy statement link down at in the footer. So that would be a good example of looking through, so on this page, you're going to see the generic process and a link to the generic privacy template. They've actually gone through a thought process as to this whole thing and deciding how to implement it on that site. And you will see the conclusion of those decisions essentially manifest in the privacy statement they linked there. So that would be something you could do if you're going through this process, to see what other people have done. Probably this community will gain greater competence in this, and you'll be able to compare notes with each other on the listserv when it's like, well, what about this certain line in the terms of service? How is this possibly okay? And some of those maybe you can answer amongst each other. Some of those maybe you're bounce to me and say, we don't get it, Brendan. How could this possibly be okay? And I will try to explain it. And it could be that goes above my level of expertise. I'm not a lawyer, so I may turn back to general counsel and say, so remind me, when we discussed this, did we think of it this way? And how does that relate to our interpretation of the law? So just simply walking through this, one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that the access to the reports and whatnot that come out of analytics, and let me just stop here and say, I'm going to assume you already know what Google Analytics is, and it does. This is not a demonstration of Google Analytics. I leave that as an exercise for the reader if you're totally unfamiliar with it. There's a ton of information out there on the website posted by your colleagues out in the world as to why you might want to use Google Analytics, what it does, how to use it really well for certain things. I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the reader. This is strictly how to go about doing it at MSU so that you're in bounds. So one of the first things to be sure of is that it's not my own personal identity. So my own personal Google account, which has nothing to do with my employment at MSU, that I'm creating all this stuff under. The account that gets access to Google Analytics kind of owns the key to give access to other people to access the reports. We want that to be a piece of institutional property. So you can leave your job and transition it to someone else, and you don't have to get into this awkward, like, oh, geez, I don't want to give them my personal Google account. How do I leave them with the ability to provision access to this? So the first step is assigning or requesting an organizational NetID. At Virtual University, we have a NetID that we've paid for years called vu@msu.edu. I can use that to create a Google account. So in other words, the non-Google email address associated with that Gmail account is vu@msu.edu. I'm not going to use it for anything else. I'm not going to use Gmail. I'm only going to use it for analytics and other things like this, strictly to provision access to people, either administrators or web developers in my unit, that need access to Google Analytics reports. So that's also the second step, right? So using vu@msu.edu to create an account may be called vu@gmail.com. You're going to have to agree to terms of service to do this, right? In setting up a Google account, you're agreeing to generic Google terms of service. On our review of the various terms of service, essentially the consensus between LC&T and General Counsel is it's acceptable for MSU employees to click through this specific terms of service agreement for this specific purpose, right? So this will be one of the stop points where normally, as an employee, you don't have authority to bind the institution to a legal contract, and a click-through agreement is essentially that. We, for years, have been installing Microsoft Office on our own computers and things like that, and agreeing to these end-user license agreements. Some of these things are seen as fairly benign. Some of them, like this, not as much. We've at least vetted this one and said, this is okay to do. We're not saying it's okay to click through every agreement on the internet, just this one. Once you've signed up for an analytics account, you can now provision access to that. So at that point, I might go to the web developers in my unit or administrators in my unit that want to see these reports directly, and I would ask them to set up their own personal Google account. If they already have one, I'm okay with using that. We're basically going to control access to the reports available in Google Analytics to each of those accounts. So that said, when those people leave their job, I can sign in with my departmental Google account, and I can take their access away. And if someone I hire in, I can go in and add that person. And at that point, we're not really worried about that person clicking through the terms of service because they're kind of doing it on a personal level. And we're okay with provisioning access to non-MSU NetIDs in that way. One of the common questions I get about this is, can I use the the Google Apps Suite that MSU has to do any of this stuff? And the answer to that right now is no. We have to turn on access beyond the Docs and Calendar applications, one application at a time. And we haven't decided to turn on analytics because we think it's actually probably good for people to have to go through these additional steps and acknowledge this policy in going and doing it. And it seems like turning it on for the Google Apps Suite makes it look like, free for all, go ahead and just use analytics. There's a need to transmit this information, and so having to go to this policy and understand how to set it up the correct way. And we think it would be harder for people to understand that this is kind of a special thing, and the process is important if it's just on that Google Apps.msu.edu page, and it looks like you can just go and use it without any thinking about it. So at the point where you've got the departmental account, you've signed up for Google Analytics, you may be giving some people access to it. In there, you can add websites that you want to track, right? So a specific host name, for instance, like vu.msu.edu. Google's going to give you a piece of code that you can then deploy on the site that has a tracking code that's specific to that website. And that's how it's going to generate your reports. At that point, if you had somebody who's like a security officer or a generic IT person might be the one that sets up this departmental account and provisions the access. I would recommend that in your department, it might not be the web developer. It might be someone else who is more routinely dealing with access control to information systems. If it's not the web developer that does that initial setup, they can then get that tracking code, give it to the web developer. They can decide where to put it on the site. Since you're all web developers, I assume you understand the difference between someone that edits content on the web and the technical skills that you can do. This Google tracking code stuff and deciding where to put it, this is clearly in your realm and clearly not in the average person's realm. You may have other people that have access to published content on your site. You definitely don't want them to be the one doing this because it matters where you deploy this. It should really be rendered on every page load on your site, but only once per page load. And if you put this code in the wrong spot, it might only be tracking use of a couple pages on your site, not your entire site, or it could be hammering the heck out of the Google servers and doing it 3 times per page load and generating bad statistics and overloading the Google servers in a way that possibly violates their terms of service. So this is clearly something that someone that's familiar with the site structure and establishes the site template should do. And at that point, you're kind of up and using it. So there's a lot more detail written here about what to take into account with that. Before you deploy the cookie, there's a couple other things that really you should do. A web developer that's expert in this realm, you need to incorporate the privacy statement into your site. That involves customization of this privacy template, this model privacy statement, which is hyperlinked off of that article. This is what we worked out with General Counsel. Basically, what we tried to do is come up with a generic privacy statement that could be customized on a site-by-site basis that probably would encompass most of what you need and met the key requirements in the Google Terms of Service as to what you're supposed to be disclosing to users. We looked at numerous other universities in terms of how they either established templates or what they just posted on their privacy statement. That said, this might not be perfect for everyone. If you're looking at your site and you have a really rich web application, it could be that you plan to collect other information about users and use it fairly actively in a way that possibly impinges on privacy. You may decide to go to General Counsel with your own draft that gets more explicit about how you're planning to use user-collected information. An example of that might be, like the University Development's website where they actually collect money from people. It's an e-commerce system. It involves sensitive information as to who gave how much money to what, how we plan to use that contact information in the future to possibly reach out and ask you for more money in the future. This might go beyond what this statement is really talking about doing. This is probably typical of your fairly normal departmental website, mostly informational to the extent that it collects things about users. It's probably maybe like subscribing to a listserv or participating in a discussion forum, something fairly benign like that. So this isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's one size fits 80% maybe. So there are instructions at the top here. Anything inside brackets is something you probably need to be customizing, like your unit name, right? So some of the stuff's pretty obvious. In a nutshell, it basically says, this privacy statement informs you of how we're going to use information we collect on the site. It starts to get specific about the kind of information collected. So there's a section that basically says information you voluntarily provide. This would be like web form kind of stuff, Like it's very obvious I'm typing in stuff into a web form. When we get down into updating personal information, like if you collect a user profile on your site, you should probably provide explicit instructions. This would be a customization point where you say, here's how you find your user profile, here's how you change and update information on it. These are fairly standard things, right, that are in web privacy statements. The sensitive part that we had to include about Google Analytics and about any server logs you have is this information we collect automatically. So in other words, it's not going to be obvious to you that we're collecting information from you. We're going to do it all the time. Whenever you're interacting with the site, it's going to appear to be passive information collection to you. And so there's some kind of in layperson explanation of what a cookie is. That's usually the technical mechanism how this stuff happens, right? And then this third-party tracking technology is the part where it gets specific to Google. And we tried to write this in a way where we're not totally specific to Google. So if Google's out of business tomorrow and stops offering this service, you might switch to using free Yahoo web tracking if such a thing comes into existence. And theoretically, a lot of this privacy statement can stay intact, and we can insert a new block that's specific to Yahoo's terms of service instead of Google's. And there's some stuff in here reminding you that whatever you do choose to put in here, it has to comply with the requirements of your third-party tracking provider. So we expect that Google's going to change their terms of service over time. They may add additional requirements for you. Very important that you not assume that we've vetted everything about this and that it never changes. When you're going to deploy this, read the Google terms of service. There are very explicit and clear instructions there about what you need to include in your privacy statement, what you need to do technically to comply with their terms of service. You need to reach your own conclusion, and I'm sure the web team did when they were deploying it, that indeed we've done everything we need to do, both in being transparent with our users and in technically providing the service. And then, so there is a block in here that we've provided that is relevant to Google Analytics at the time this was drafted, which was about July of last year. And some links. We want to link to the terms of service Google provides. We want to link to any information they provide that's directed towards consumers about what's really going on. Particularly important thing to link to would be how to opt out. There's almost always a way in your browser to configure your browser to not accept these kind of tracking cookies or to notify you before accepting them. There are, for instance, plugins I could install on Firefox that block all tracking cookies from Google, Microsoft, you name it. It's good to inform users that they have that option. This is one of the things we think is important if we're going to kind of impose this on users. There was a day when we insisted on buying our own tracking technology. We used to license Urchin, which Google bought in order to implement analytics, and it was a standalone server product. Basically, you had a server appliance that sat in, all it did was crunch server logs. The license for the software was measured in the tens of thousands of dollars. And I don't know what all we searched on that, but I don't think it got much farther than www.msu.edu, which is to say there's thousands of other websites on campus that we didn't bother to cover with that license. Couldn't afford to. Took a lot of labor to do to maintain that server platform. We've traded that cost for free service. The downside is the users now, in their use of our websites that use this tracking cookie, they don't have as much privacy as they used to have. There was a point, back in the 90s when Paul Hunt was the vice provost and the acceptable use policy said users' privacy is the most important thing in the universe, even to the detriment of us running the network. That would be my own personal interpretation of Paul's stance on this issue. If Paul knew we were using Google Analytics, he'd probably come and wring my neck. Hope he doesn't watch this recording. Because this is a trade-off between convenience to us and access to this information, which helps us improve our websites, which makes our websites a better public asset, with the user's kind of global right to privacy on the internet. And that's probably something you should think about before you deploy this. If I was running the library catalog, I would not be putting Google Analytics on it, because it's probably hard to avoid making it apparent what people are looking for in that catalog from this tracking information. Theoretically, it's anonymous. And this gets us into the next thing that you need to worry about as a web developer. In addition to customizing this privacy statement, you need to audit your site and make sure it complies with the technical terms of service, and there's two main things to avoid there. First and foremost, a really general avoidance, and this is explicitly against Google's terms of service. You are not to attempt to correlate the tracking cookie, so in other words, the unique identifier, which is a big ugly serial number of letters and numbers, in that user's cookie. So on their user agent, they have a cookie that uniquely identifies them across all websites on the internet, right? It's not just your site, it's all sites that use the Google tracking cookie. This is how, by adding the tracking cookie, you're contributing to that giant collection of information that Google has about that user. Your reports give you access only to your wedge, but their database has everything the user does on the internet, on any site that uses Google's tracking cookie. And this is how it's a privacy concern. You're not to try to uniquely identify that user's tracking code to something you know about them as personally identifiable. And on a lot of our web applications, when I use it, you know that I'm Brendan Guenther. You're not to try to figure out a correlation between Brendan Guenther and that tracking code. They explicitly forbid you from doing this. On the Google web forums, frequently there are web developers that are actively asking on the forums, how do I go about doing that? And all the other web developers say, boo on you, that's evil, and it's against the rules. You shouldn't even be asking that question, you fool. We want to make sure that our use of this is above board. We don't want to see anybody doing that here. There's no reason to do that. I think that's against our institutional norms in terms of internet privacy. And certainly, we don't want you violating Google's terms of service. In accepting the free service, you've accepted that you're not going to try to personally identify that person. Even if you have 12 websites in your college and you really would love to know how Brendan Guenther is using all 12 of those websites across there, you're just not going to be able to figure it out without violating this rule. And I would say there's no business interest at the university that trumps this concern. Even if Google didn't impose this rule, we would probably be asking that you not do this. The second thing you need to do is make sure that if, particularly in the case of a web application, your web application is not encoding variables which contain personally identifiable information in the URL. So query string variables, GET requests that include my identity as the consumer of the information. So like if I go to, I'm assuming everyone's following what I'm talking about. This is where it gets a little bit technical. But if you go to, I'm going to guess here, and I'm going to guess if I go to msu.edu and I do the people search, that probably that's a GET request. Is it? We shall see. It is not. Okay, so one of the things it could have been doing here, if that wasn't a post, is it could have been putting in the URL here a variable name and what I typed into this form field. That's probably fine because that's just anybody searching for Brendan. That doesn't really matter much. But if I had logged into this, if it was Angel, and in the process of logging in, it encoded that I'm Brendan and msu.edu up in the URL string, that URL string gets recorded with the tracking information, right? This is in your server logs now. The difference is now you're sharing it with Google, and you're sharing it in a way that it's, at least within Google's database, they now know that Brendan and msu.edu is this certain serial number. You accidentally just violated Google's terms of service and did the exact thing I was just telling you should avoid. So there needs to be an auditing probably of your server logs to just verify that the encoded variables that happen in the URL aren't recording personally identifiable information of the person using the site. This is a relatively trivial thing to do. If you have access to your server logs now, search. Search for the @ email addresses. Try to figure out if those are benign collection of email addresses or potentially malicious collection of email addresses. Search for usernames. And I think there's a gray area here. Like is a uniquely identifiable user ID, is that dangerous? I don't know. I mean, we haven't been asked too many specific questions about this. If you're not sure, that would be something maybe to bounce to me. I'll probably get some collection of us, like people on the web team together, and maybe even someone from general counsel, and we're trying to decide, like, is that okay or not? We haven't been faced with too many specific questions about this yet, but this is what we want you to watch out for when you audit your site. Those are kind of the three main points: how to go about setting up the account, how to customize the privacy template, and deploy the privacy template on your statement on your site, and things to audit your site for before you go ahead and deploy the tracking cookie. Those are the three main legs on which we're hoping you stand. Anybody have questions while I'm here?
Given that this policy was kind of created for Google Analytics, but we still have websites which have server logs, would it be appropriate to post this on every site that's collecting information, even if you're...
Yeah, you could wipe out
information.
Yeah, so just to repeat the question in case the people in the back couldn't hear that, the question was, if we're just using server logs and we're not using Google Analytics or some other third-party tracking, would it be a good idea to customize this privacy template to our sites and use it anyway? And I would say yes. Go ahead and just wipe out the third-party tracking component. I think this kind of disclosure statement about what you're using your server logs for and what information you're collecting in them about your web users is a good idea. If you don't already have a privacy statement, it's just good net etiquette to have a privacy statement. There's no reason you couldn't just disclose that, even just for use of our own server logs. If you were using Urchin, for instance, and not using Google Analytics, I would still disclose. And in the privacy template, there is I believe room in there. The next section, which I never bothered to scroll down to, gets into server logs. And it says specifically, this is what we collect in our server logs. If you were collecting something else, because you can customize these on your server configuration, you should probably change this section so that it accurately reflects what you're doing. Any other questions?
What will happen if we're using Google Analytics and we fail to implement a privacy statement?
If you're using Google Analytics and you fail to implement a privacy statement, you would be violating Google's terms of service, and to the extent that you clicked through that agreement and agreed to bind the institution to that agreement, you've now created a liability for Michigan State University. As an employee, I think that's something I would try to avoid. I can say with certainty I do try to avoid. And I think probably, yeah, that's just poor professional practice. I would hope that, although web developers, I think as a community don't have a really strong professional organization that has imposed an ethical code of conduct, that everyone in this room would try to avoid doing that. And certainly I am in the process of trying to make sure all the sites that we, a long time ago, deployed these tracking cookies on, that we're in the process of going back and forming policies on to get ourselves out of this exact ethical lapse that we accidentally got ourselves into. It's a good question.
So this privacy statement applies only website or web application is being developed in MSU? Does not apply to third-party application like, I don't know, SurveyMonkeys or
Yeah.
board?
So this whole privacy template and doctrine that we came up with really is for MSU websites. It doesn't necessarily apply to other applications. I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at amongst like the communicators group, which is pretty closely aligned to this group, is use of like social network tracking tools, email marketing campaign tools. This gets into a really similar realm, similar kind of reports for a similar business purpose, but often not driven through the website. And I'd say this is an approach that's specific to MSU-owned websites, not necessarily hosted out, in some kind of like Facebook pages, for instance, as web-based. There are lessons you could probably translate, but I'd say I wouldn't attempt to use this directly to make that translation.
I was wondering if on your website and you've got tools like the like buttons in Facebook, and you've got the ability to like or dislike, and if in the third-party vendor area, if you display the information that you're doing that, if that corrects that situation.
I think if you're using like a Facebook like button and embedding that on your website, that's a good example of a use of another tool which we know has privacy implications. Including that in your privacy statement here is definitely a good thing. The thing that I think this whole doctrine doesn't necessarily cover is that whole doctrine as to who set up the Facebook account, who owns the Facebook page. Are there other things that are happening in the pressing of that like button in terms of data collection that happens on Facebook that involves agreement to a terms of service, a Facebook terms of service, that maybe we should go to General Counsel and say, is it okay that MSU employees bind the institution to this Facebook agreement? I would say those are things that it's like you can interpret a lot from this doctrine and probably establish a similar doctrine. If this community has a strong desire to use the Facebook like button, it would probably be a good idea to be specific about some of those discussions, rather than every single one of us handling them on an ad hoc basis. And it would be a good idea to take things that are going to be commonly used and go to General Counsel and ask for explicit clarification as to what exactly should we put in this privacy statement, how exactly should we establish a use doctrine, and can they give us a legal opinion as to the acceptability of that terms of service. Because what they do is they can look at that cloud computing memo, and as lawyers, as legal experts, they can interpret some of the business concerns that we have embedded in that memo in a way that those of us as general practitioners don't quite look at it the same way. I can say I definitely found value in talking. I worked with Lee Bollinger in General Counsel's office, and Lee was tremendously helpful in arriving at a well-worded, well-considered use of Google Analytics. And I think Christine Zako actually signed off on, yeah, this is an acceptable package of information. And if we're going to use Facebook or an email marketing tool, I'd say we should probably, if there's some consensus that forms amongst this group that in this certain service sector, this is the tool to use, we should go ahead and take that discussion there. It'll be easier now having gone through this. Yeah.
So in theory, an end user could be bouncing around from site to site within the MSU EDU domain, and so they would be going from one private policy to another policy to another policy. And is there any concern that it's not necessarily transparent that that policy is changing to the end user?
That's a really good question. I'd put that in the philosophical realm where it's like I'm not even going to try to provide a solid answer to that. I think at the beginning of the privacy statement, we tried to make it clear what the scope of the privacy statement was. So when you're reading the www.msu privacy statement, it's pretty clear that this applies to the primary university homepage, but the further you travel down the link path, the less likely that policy is to apply. I'd say the same thing applies in use of this privacy template anywhere. Whether users understand that, I don't know. I'm not sure they understand anything in these privacy statements. I'm not sure how many people read them. I suppose if we embedded the tracking code on this, we'll eventually be able to answer that question. I mean, we should know how many people clicked on it ever. Whether they understood it, I don't know. This gets really into the realm of, and I think that's why it's useful to have that local debate, or even for yourself in deciding, for my site, is this fair game? You don't have to link to the privacy statement in the footer. You can make it more prominent. I'd say the more sensitive the nature of your site is, the more rigorously you should review this, and the more you thought you should put into how you're informing your users. You have tools at your own disposal in where you choose to place the link, whether you, like on Angel, for instance, there's an explicit paragraph that talks about privacy and the surveillance that happens in the learning management system. We've debated where to put that on the homepage, where to put that in the login process, whether to include it on the footer of every single page. And that's evolved over time. But that's an example where it's like just a link down at the bottom we thought was insufficient. We've given it more prominent placement. You could argue that we could give it even more prominent placement than we have. That's a good question to consider, I think, every time you go to implement this. Am I totally out of time yet?
No, we're not, but if I could ask a question of the folks here. By a show of hands, how many of you are using Google Analytics right now for your sites? And I am. We're using it. How many of you are using Facebook like buttons at this point? Okay. That may very well be the kind, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that may very well be the kind of thing that we want to do as a next step on this. Yeah. Is have a conversation with council about that sort of piece.
So I'm just going to guess, because I'm guessing the camera suite probably didn't capture the hands quite fast enough. Was that about 50% for use of Google Analytics, give or take? And maybe like 1/5 to 1/4 for use of the like button?
That's just a couple.
Yeah.
Well, there's just a couple people with a like button. But
okay.
It seemed like 3/4 of people raised their hands about Google Analytics. No more.
What are people finding value in Google Analytics so far? Like, what are you using the reports for?
Well, it's fast and it helps me to track, especially mobile use, which is easier. And actually, it makes it easier for me to distinguish access from staff network and actual users. Google allows me to do that easily. Yeah.
So you're not mistaking actual patrons from people that are just testing the site, or internal people that are using it as a replacement for the phone directory or something like that. It helps with like analyzing browser usage trends, device usage trends.
It's generally way nicer user interface and faster than other tools I've used. Yeah.
Does anyone use like the bounce page analysis or the search term analysis to actually change the content of the site or the design of the site? Can you talk about that a little bit? Like what have you actually made design changes that were informed?
We've changed some of the meta tags on some of the pages based on search terms, because our site is really split between internal and external users, and the external users search for things completely differently than the internal users do. So we have to make sure our keywords take both of those things into consideration, or we're not serving both parts of our audience.
Yeah, for MSU libraries, I totally disregard bounds because we expect to have higher bounds. Yeah, you don't always find what you're looking for. Yeah. That's okay. It depends on the nature of the site. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the difficult thing about using Google Analytics, I find, is that there are some assumptions baked into the tool, like that people got to your site through an advertising campaign and an initial bounce is a bad thing. And some sites that's not necessarily a fair assumption. But I think it has helped us decide how do we segment our audience, and how does the usage differ across those audience segments. And certainly, we've learned a lot about what are the popular pieces of content on our site. A lot of the sites I own are content rich, and we have, in our expert mind, an idea of what's relevant to the world, but they obviously have a slightly different weighting of those values, and that's helped inform us as to,
which pages are totally irrelevant and we're just putting up for our own sense of compliance and which one are people consuming and where should we invest our time and improvement, right? Yeah.
I'm not using Google Analytics, but we use analytics on our departmental website and found that most of our users are undergraduates and use the search terms and the pages they use to help guide our FAQ design, because that's one of our big goals is to tell the undergraduates what they need to know, right? And so the analytics has been crucial to figure out what it is they're looking for.
Yeah.
Somebody in the back row?
Oh, that was just a minute ago, but I would say for CAS, for the mobile site, we use Google Analytics to see what people needed right away because we wanted people to get the information as quickly as possible. And so that's what we use.
Yeah. So if I have time to squeeze a little announcement in here, this is vaguely related in that it's a recent, service/policy development. MSU is a member of the In Common Federation, so if you've used EduCause lately and you didn't bother to set up an EduCause account, you might have noticed that on their login page they've got a little link under that says that if you're an In Common member, you can sign in through that. And what that allows you to do is use your MSU Net ID. So I don't even need an account on the EduCause site anymore. This is just a working example. If you click on that, it takes you to a Where Are You From service, which basically asks which institution are you from. And if you're doing it from on campus, it tends to identify that you must be coming from Merit. So you must either be a U of M person or an MSU person. It gives you a little shortcut in the giant list of institutions that are in common members. And you click on MSU, and then you get the MSU Net ID login box. I can just do Brendan at MSU.edu and log in with my Net ID password without creating an account. And I think there are going to be more and more services like that. So this is one of the most direct benefits of being an In Common member. They also, are giving us essentially access to SSL certificates at a really reduced price. We had to pay a fair amount out of pocket at the institutional level in order to get access to this, but Libraries Computing Technologies decided to do this, so we have the ability to generate these certificates that are at a reduced cost on tech.msu.edu, and I'm not entirely sure what to search for here. I don't know if this is linked or not yet. It is. So if you type in SSL into the search box, the first thing here that comes up in keywords, so I bet if you type in SSL to the MSU homepage, it's going to do the same thing. Is that true? Or is this different? I don't know. Anyway, on tech.msu.edu, if you type in SSL, it'll work. There's this SSL page, and this describes kind of the pricing framework. These are certificates provided by Komodo, so that's a major SSL provider. It's going to work in every browser is what that means. If you buy a 3-year certificate, it's $10 per year. This is a very competitive price with what you can get out there on the internet. So this probably becomes, we hope, the path of least resistance for you to generate certificates. If any of you are using wildcard certificates, which is to say any subdomain .something.msu.edu works with the SSL certificate, those aren't as secure. It leaves your users open to man-in-the-middle attacks and other things like that. There was a business reason why you might have chosen to buy a wildcard certificate, because it was cheaper than buying bunches and bunches of other certificates. This should eliminate that motivation. If you have a wildcard certificate, we recommend that you go ahead and just buy these instead. There's 2 ways to do this. You can just use this request form and log in. Lisa knows who I am now, right? And fill this in and choose what you want, and someone will generate it for you. If you think you're going to be generating just a ton of these certificates, then you can get, I think your department can actually request someone in your department that has the ability to generate these themselves. That would probably be an IT person. And that, I think we're asking for like a 3-year commitment, and it's a fair amount of out-of-pocket money, but I believe the College of Natural Science might have already taken us up on this, Matt Stahauer. So obviously for some of us to have lots and lots of these certificates, it makes sense. It certainly gives you more direct access to just do it yourself, and it might actually, in the end of the day, be cheaper for you. If you want to do that and you want to talk to somebody about it, Scott Thomas in ATS, who I'm kind of presenting this on behalf of because he couldn't make it today, he said you could go ahead and contact him directly if you want to talk about getting department-wide access and you had questions about it. I believe that's in this article too. Maybe unlimited subdomain SSL certificate request form. So this is if I want one certificate at a time. This one down here is if I want to have someone in my department just be able to crank these things out at will. this is available now, so feel free to take advantage of it. I think it's a good deal.